Some stories begin with the roar of a stadium. This one begins with a silence that feels like a physical weight. On the 27th of August 1994, in the gated enclave of Bel-Air, the air was still, heavy with the scent of jasmine and the chemical tang of chlorine. But inside Donald Bohana's estate, the atmosphere was shifting into a sequence of events that would take years to fully decipher. At Trey, Patruzech, Shishapte, DM, a 911 call shattered the quiet. The man on the other end was Donald Bohana, a wealthy businessman and a prominent figure in the Los Angeles community. His voice, captured on the official recording, carried a frantic, gasping edge. He reported that a woman had drowned. He described it as a tragic accident, a midnight swim that had simply gone wrong after an evening of drinking wine. When the paramedics arrived, they found a scene that would complicate the investigative record for nearly 4 years. Delores, Dee Dee Jackson, 39 years old and a mother of 3, was floating in the deep end of the swimming pool. She was pronounced dead shortly after. The initial forensic observation listed drowning as the cause, but the physical evidence on Dee Dee's body suggested a more complex struggle. The autopsy revealed over 50 separate injuries, lacerations on her lips and tongue, deep bruises on her ears and head, and hemorrhages in her neck. To the investigators, these were blunt force traumas marks that traditionally indicate physical resistance rather than the fluid mechanics of a drowning. The most glaring inconsistency, however, was not on the body, but in the victim's history. To the public, she was the former wife of Tito Jackson, but to those who knew her intimately, there was one immutable fact. Dee Dee Jackson had a lifelong, paralyzing fear of water. She was a non-swimmer who famously avoided the deep end of any pool. She was the kind of woman who treated even a bathtub with a sense of caution. The question hung in the humid night air. How does a woman with a chronic phobia of drowning end up in the deep end of a pool at 3 o'clock in the morning? Bohana provided a detailed account of the night. He stated that the bruises were the result of his desperate attempts to save her, claiming he used a pool pole to hook her clothing and drag her to the surface. He explained the facial injuries as a consequence of her thrashing in a panic. But the forensic clock provided a different narrative. Bohana's clothes were noted as being remarkably dry for a man who had supposedly dove in for a rescue. The timeline between the incident and the 911 call remained a point of friction for the detectives. Despite the physical trauma and the illogical nature of the midnight swim, the Los Angeles County coroner eventually released a report that felt like a stalemate to the Jackson family. The ruling was undetermined. In the high-stakes environment of mid-90 Los Angeles, Bohana was a man of significant influence, a pioneer of black entrepreneurship with deep political and social ties. For a time, it appeared that the case would rest in the files of the unexplained. But the investigation shows that the undetermined ruling was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of a relentless crusade. The state of California had paused its clock, but Dee Dee's 3 sons, Taj, Taryll, and TJ, were just beginning to speak. The investigative record of Delores Martez begins not in a mansion, but in the vibrant, crowded streets of New York City. Born to Dominican parents who separated shortly after her birth, Dee Dee's early life was a study in resilience. In 1968, her mother moved the family to Los Angeles. It was a city of glittering opportunity, but for an immigrant family, it was also a city of hard boundaries. Dee Dee grew up fast, learning that grace was not something you were born with, but something you maintained through struggle. By her sophomore year at Fairfax High School, the trajectory of her life shifted permanently. She met a shy, soft-spoken boy with a quiet rhythm in his step, Tito Jackson. At the time, Tito was not yet a global icon, but the Jackson 5 were already a localized storm. While his brothers, Michael and Jermaine, were often in the spotlight, Tito was the steady hand, the guitarist who held the rhythm. In Dee Dee, he found his counterpart. She wasn't impressed by the growing fame. She was drawn to the boy behind the guitar. The investigation into their early relationship shows a rare kind of loyalty. While the Jackson 5 toured the world, playing for thousands of screaming fans, Tito would spend his nights in hotel rooms making long-distance calls back to Los Angeles. Dee Dee was his tether to reality. She was the one person who didn't want anything from him except his time. They married young in 1972, a quiet ceremony that contrasted sharply with the high-decibel life of the Motown machine. While the world saw the Jacksons as a product of show business, Dee Dee worked to build a traditional home. She became the Ma Neo, the anchor. As Tito moved through the chaos of global tours and recording sessions, Dee Dee was the one creating a sanctuary. She understood early on that in a family where everyone was a star, someone had to be the ground. She poured her energy into her three sons, Taj, Taryll, and TJ. The records of the Jackson household during the late 70s and 80s describe a woman who was fiercely protective of her children's normalcy. She refused to let the tabloids or the industry raise them. Friends described the home as a place of warm chaos, where music was always playing, but it was the sound of children laughing and home-cooked meals being prepared, not the sound of business meetings. Even as the Jackson 5 transitioned into the Jacksons and Michael's solo career reached stratospheric heights, Dee Dee remained a private, stabilizing force. But the investigation also notes the toll this role takes. By 1993, after 2 thupki of marriage, Dee Dee and Tito divorced. It was a separation noted for its lack of bitterness. They remained co-parents, neighbors, and friends. Tito would later state that she remained his first and truest friend. However, the divorce left a vacuum. For the first time in her adult life, Dee Dee Jackson was not defined by her role as a wife to a superstar. She was a single mother in her late 30s, navigating a world that still saw her as a Jackson, even as she tried to find herself. She was looking for stability, for a partnership that belonged only to her. This was the vulnerable state in which she met Donald Bohana. He was nearly 20 years her senior, a man who radiated the kind of established power that she believed could offer her the peace she deserved. To an outsider, it looked like a second chance at happiness. But the investigative trail shows that for a woman who had survived the storms of the music industry, she was about to enter a much deeper, more dangerous water. By the early 1990s, Donald Bohana was more than just a businessman. He was a carefully constructed symbol of the new Los Angeles. He was an entrepreneur who had successfully navigated the jagged complexities of race, class, and power to build a diversified empire that commanded respect across the city. He owned insurance firms, healthcare facilities, and even a private aircraft, the ultimate signifier of status in Southern California. The investigation into his public profile reveals a man who was meticulously obsessed with the optics of success. He was a pioneer who made headlines for opening a Denny's franchise in Watts, a neighborhood that most wealthy investors avoided. This move earned him the title of a community savior, a black entrepreneur who was giving back to the streets that raised him. To the public, Donald Bohana was the American dream, in a tailored Italian suit. To Dee Dee Jackson, he appeared to be the partner she had been searching for, someone who was established in his own right, someone who wasn't intimidated by the gravity of the Jackson name, and someone who offered a version of stability that didn't involve the chaotic orbit of a touring musician. However, the investigation into the chasm, the vast, dark space between Bohana's public image and his private reality, tells a different story. Beneath the surface of charity galas, political handshakes, and candlelight dinners, Bohana's financial world was undergoing a slow-motion, catastrophic collapse. Court records from the early 90s show a mounting pile of lawsuits, IRS liens, and massive personal debts. He was a man holding onto a lifestyle he could no longer afford, and he was doing so with a level of desperation that was becoming increasingly volatile. He wasn't just losing his money, he was losing the mask that allowed him to move through the halls of power. When he met Dee Dee, the investigative trail suggests he saw more than a woman. He saw a strategic connection to one of the most liquid brands in global history. He took her to restaurants lit by the soft glow of Bel-Air and whispered promises of a shared, peaceful future. Friends noted that Dee Dee seemed to glow again, believing she had finally found a man who saw her for the person she was, rather than just Tito's ex-wife. For a woman who had spent decades as the anchor for others, Bohana played the role of the anchor for her. But the investigation also reveals the subtle, chilling red flags that those closest to Dee Dee began to notice. Her sons, Taj, Taryll, and TJ, possessed a sharp, intuitive caution born from growing up in the glare of the spotlight. They noted that Bohana's charm felt performative, a script written for an audience. Taj would later recount that Bohana looked at the boys like props in a show rather than human beings. The forensic analysis of his behavior during this period shows a pattern of coercive control. He was charming one minute and icy the next. When he spoke, it was a monologue designed to dominate. When he acted, it was a command disguised as a suggestion. The investigative records show a rising tension in the summer of 1994. As Bohana's financial pressure reached a breaking point, he reportedly began to pressure Dee Dee to leverage her Jackson connections. He wanted access to the family's capital, their global influence, and their name to bail out his failing insurance and restaurant ventures. But Dee Dee, the woman who had spent 20 years protecting her sons from the industry's greed, stood her ground. She was the anchor, and she would not let her children's future be used to shore up a stranger's crumbling empire. The records of her final weeks show that the arguments between them became more frequent and more intense. Dee Dee's voice, usually a source of calm, began to carry a tremor of anxiety. Her phone calls to her sister and friends became shorter, more rehearsed, and filled with a quiet, lingering uncertainty. She confided in her sister that she was thinking about ending the relationship. Bà muốn bắt đầu lại, tập trung hoàn toàn vào ba người con trai đang ở đỉnh cao sự nghiệp của mình. She was planning an exit. She was looking for a way out of the chasm. But as any investigator of domestic patterns will tell you, an exit is often the most dangerous move a woman can make in the presence of a controlling personality. On the night of the 27th of August 1994, she drove to Bohana's mansion in Bel-Air, likely believing she could end things with the same grace she had lived her life. She didn't realize that for a man losing his empire, the one thing he couldn't afford to lose was his control over the woman who represented his last chance at salvation. The night of the 27th of August 1994 began with a dinner that Donald Bohana described as a picture of domestic tranquility. He told investigators they shared a late meal, drank expensive wine, and sat by the pool under the expansive California stars. But the forensic reconstruction of that evening suggests a timeline of violence that bears no resemblance to Bohana's narrative. According to his statement, at approximately 3:30 a.m., Tito Jackson, after an evening of leisure, suddenly decided she wanted to go for a swim. To any seasoned investigator, this is the first and most glaring red flag. For a woman with a documented, lifelong phobia of water, a woman who famously wouldn't enter a pool even at high noon, the idea of a spontaneous 3 a.m. plunge into the deep end was a fundamental breach of human logic. Bohana claimed he tried to talk her out of it, but that she persisted with uncharacteristic stubbornness. He described her swimming a few strokes before suddenly going still and sinking to the bottom. What followed, in his words, was a frantic, heroic rescue attempt. Running for a pool pole, trying to hook her clothing, and eventually diving in himself to pull her lifeless body to the surface. However, when the first responders from the Los Angeles Fire Department arrived at 3:55 a.m., the visual evidence immediately contradicted the story of a desperate struggle. Bohana was standing on the pool deck, and while he claimed to have just dived into the deep end to save her, his clothing and hair showed minimal signs of saturation. The moisture on his skin did not match the profile of a man who had just engaged in a life-or-death underwater struggle. The most condemning evidence, however, was not what was missing from Bohana's appearance, but what was present on Dee Dee's body. The autopsy, performed by the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner, revealed a level of trauma that was entirely inconsistent with a simple drowning or an accidental fall. There were over 50 separate injuries recorded across her physical frame. Her face, in particular, was a map of raw violence. A bruised forehead, lacerated lips, a tongue bitten through with force, and jagged tearing on her ears. These were not the soft injuries associated with water impact. They were the results of direct, blunt force application. Investigators focused their attention on the neck and subdermal tissues. They discovered deep, internal hemorrhaging bruising that occurs only when a significant amount of manual pressure is applied to the throat. These are the classic signatures of manual strangulation, or a powerful, sustained restraint. In a typical drowning case, the lungs and the presence of foam cones are the focus of the pathology, but in Dee Dee's case, the external, blunt force trauma told a story of a physical assault that took place before her lungs ever touched water. The forensic conclusion was grim. She hadn't just inhaled water, she had been physically overwhelmed and placed into the pool to mask the primary assault. Bohana attempted to explain these 50 distinct wounds as accidental injuries caused by the aluminum pool pole during his frantic rescue. He claimed that in his panic and the darkness of the night, he hit her repeatedly while trying to hook her body and pull her to the side. But the physics of the pole did not align with the nature of the wounds. The lacerations on her lips and the specific hemorrhaging in her neck were intimate injuries. They required the kind of direct, close-quarter force that a long, flexible pole cannot generate from the deck of a pool. You cannot, accidentally, bite through your own tongue or sustain deep neck hemorrhages from a blunt aluminum hook handled by someone trying to save you. Furthermore, the toxicology report provided the final fracture in his alibi. While Bohana claimed they had been drinking heavily throughout the night, implying she was intoxicated and clumsy, Dee Dee's blood alcohol level was remarkably low. She was well below the legal limit and far from the threshold of drunkenness that would cause a person to lose their footing or consciousness in a pool. She was sober, she was terrified of the water, and she was covered in wounds that looked like a systematic beating. Every piece of scientific data pointed toward the fact that the swimming pool was not the scene of an accident, but the scene of a staged cover-up. Despite this mountain of forensic friction, the initial legal proceedings hit a wall of political and social influence. In 1994, Donald Bohana's standing in Los Angeles acted as a formidable shield. The coroner's office, perhaps feeling the weight of Bohana's ties to the city's elite, refused to officially label the death a homicide. They chose the word undetermined. To an investigator, undetermined is a void, a place where justice goes to wait in silence. For the state of California, the body had spoken, but the system wasn't ready to listen to the frequency of her pain. However, for Tito Jackson and his 3 sons, the undetermined ruling was not a conclusion, it was a call to arms. They knew the truth didn't belong to the bureaucrats. It belonged to the bruises on their mother's face. In the immediate wake of the undetermined ruling, the case of Dee Dee Jackson threatened to vanish into the archives of Los Angeles's unsolved tragedies. For Donald Bohana, undetermined was a legal sanctuary, a shadow he could inhabit while maintaining his status among the city's elite. But for Tito Jackson and his sons, Taj, Taryll, and TJ, it was an unacceptable silence. They understood a grim reality. In a city like Los Angeles, silence is the primary currency of the powerful. The Jacksons initiated a campaign of institutional pressure that the district attorney's office had rarely experienced. They didn't just hire attorneys, they hired scientific truth seekers. Recognizing that the initial coroner's report was Bohana's primary shield, they commissioned 4 independent autopsies. They sought out the nation's preeminent forensic pathologists to reread the map of trauma on Dee Dee's body. Each examination returned the same chilling conclusion. The wounds were pre-mortem and non-accidental. Dee Dee had been physically subdued and strangled before her lungs ever touched the water. The investigation shows that the family was essentially operating a private prosecution office, compiling a dossier of evidence so overwhelming that the original ruling began to look like institutional negligence. During this grueling 4-year wait, Dee Dee's sons, performing as the R and B group 3 Tons, were reaching the summit of their musical fame. Their debut album, Brotherhood, was a global phenomenon, but the investigation into their personal lives reveals a suffocating mask. Every television interview and high-energy stage performance was fueled by a private, jagged grief. They utilized their global platform to keep their mother's name in the headlines, turning every press opportunity into a plea for accountability. They weren't just pop stars, they were the guardians of a legacy that had been violently interrupted. By 1996, the pressure caused the system to buckle. Under the weight of new forensic data and persistent media coverage, the district attorney officially reopened the case. The investigation shifted from an accident inquiry into a deep dive into Bohana's psychological architecture. Prosecutors interviewed former associates and ex-partners, revealing a pattern that mirrored the violence on Dee Dee's body. Witnesses described a man whose charm was a calculated lure and whose control was a steel cage, a man who became erratic when his financial empire fractured and his authority was challenged. The trial finally commenced in 1998. It was a collision of two worlds, the fading influence of a businessman in debt and the moral resolve of a grieving dynasty. The prosecution's strategy was anchored in the body's testimony. They presented the 50 injuries as a chronological narrative of rage. They argued that an argument over money, specifically Dee Dee's refusal to bail out Bohana's failing businesses, had escalated into a brutal physical assault. The pool, they contended, was a clumsy attempt to wash away the evidence of a beating. The ultimate turning point in the jury's deliberations was a return to the victim's humanity, the realization that a woman with a lifelong terror of water would never have been in that pool voluntarily at 3 a.m. The logic of her fear was more powerful than the lies of his ego. In late 1998, the gavel descended. Donald Bohana was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 15 years to life. The 4-year war was over. The Jacksons had proven that even in the gated shadows of Bel-Air, you cannot bury a crime. But they were left with a hollow space at the center of their family, a silence that no verdict could ever truly fill. The conviction of Donald Bohana in 1998 provided a legal conclusion, but the investigation into the Jackson family's emotional recovery shows that a verdict is not a cure. For Taj, Taryll, and TJ, the end of the trial meant they no longer had to spend every waking hour as amateur detectives or public advocates. They were finally forced to confront the quiet, hollow reality of a world without their mother. The investigative records of their career during the late 90s reveal a profound shift in their creative output. They began to use their music not just as a platform for justice, but as a vessel for a specific kind of grief work that only those who have lost the center of their world can truly understand. Their debut album, Brotherhood, which had been their shield during the 4-year war, took on a new, sacred meaning. Songs like Why, featuring their uncle Michael Jackson, were no longer just R&B ballads. They became public elegies. The investigation finds that the brothers were navigating a unique Jackson paradox. They were members of the most famous family on earth, yet they were grieving a woman who had fought her entire life to keep them grounded in normalcy. To heal, they had to reconcile the Dee Dee Jackson of the headlines with the mom who used to bake cakes and cheer from the front row. As we dig deeper into the psychological aftermath, we see the ripple effects within the larger Jackson dynasty. Tito Jackson, the man who had lost his first love and the mother of his children, found himself in a state of quiet, dignified mourning. The investigation shows that Tito's role shifted during this period. He became the primary protector of his sons' mental health, shielding them from the same industry pressures that Dee Dee had once guarded them against. The bond between the father and his 3 sons became the primary structure that prevented the family from collapsing under the weight of the trauma. They weren't just a band anymore. They were a survival unit. However, being a Jackson meant that their healing was never truly private. The media continued to revisit the details of the pool and the bruises, forcing the brothers to relive the nightmare in every press junket. The investigative trail shows that 3 Tons made a conscious decision to pivot. Instead of allowing the victim narrative to define their identity, they began to weave themes of resilience, loyalty, and the endurance of love into their lyrics. They were proving a fundamental truth of the human condition, that music can act as a bridge between the world of the living and the memories of the dead. In the early 2000s, as the group moved past their initial wave of global superstardom, the investigation notes a period of deep, spiritual reflection. They were no longer just Tito's sons or Michael's nephews. They were men who had stared into the darkest corners of human nature, power, control, and violence, and had come out with their integrity intact. They realized that their mother's true legacy was not the tragedy of her death, but the quality of the life she had instilled in them during those high school years at Fairfax. They began to understand that every note they sang was, in essence, a continuation of her heartbeat. The investigation into this period concludes that the Jackson name, often associated with glitz and scandal, had found a new, somber depth through 3 tons. They had survived the gated shadows of Bel-Air and the cold hallways of the Los Angeles courts, and they had done so without becoming cynical. They were healing, not by forgetting what happened in that swimming pool, but by ensuring that the sound of their music and the strength of their brotherhood was louder than the silence of that night. They were moving beyond the verdict, transforming a crime scene into a sanctuary of song. Time has a way of smoothing the jagged edges of tragedy, but for the Jackson family, the passage of years didn't mean moving away from Dee Dee. It meant moving with her. The investigation into the long-term legacy of Delores Martez reveals that she was never truly silenced on that night in 1994. Instead, her voice underwent a profound amplification. As her sons Taj, Taryll, and TJ matured, they realized that the most powerful monument they could build for their mother wasn't one of stone or marble. It was a living, breathing system of support for others who walked the same dark path of grief they once did. In 2013, nearly 2 decades after the gavel fell on Donald Bohana, the brothers established the Dee Dee Jackson Foundation, DDJF. The investigation into the foundation's mission shows a direct lineage back to the warm chaos of Dee Dee's kitchen. Its purpose is simple but revolutionary: to provide a community for those navigating loss and to use music and storytelling as tools for healing. They didn't want other children to feel the same isolated silence they felt when the world was focused on the Jackson scandal rather than their personal heartbreak. Through programs like the Power of Love podcast and various community workshops, the brothers have turned their mother's name into a global symbol of emotional resilience. The investigative record of the Jackson dynasty often focuses on the price of fame, but Dee Dee's legacy offers a different perspective: the power of normalcy. By prioritizing her children's character over their celebrity, she equipped them with the one thing fame often destroys: the capacity for genuine empathy. Today, the foundation works with schools and community centers to help people process complicated grief, particularly losses involving violence or sudden trauma. They have taken the clinical evidence of their mother's death, the bruises, the fear, the legal battle, and repurposed it into a curriculum of compassion. As we look at the surviving members of her family today, the forensic evidence of her impact is undeniable. Tito Jackson, until his final days, spoke of her with a reverence that suggested their bond was never truly severed by a divorce decree or a tragedy. Her sons have become fathers themselves, passing down the same Dominican-American values of loyalty and grace that Dee Dee learned in the streets of New York. The investigation concludes that Dee Dee Jackson was the secret weapon of the Jackson family, the woman who taught them that real strength isn't found in a spotlight, but in the quiet courage required to be kind when the world is cruel. The final verdict on this case is one that no jury could ever deliver. It is a verdict on the human spirit. The investigation of the night the music stopped in California finds that the music didn't actually stop, it simply changed its key. It moved from a minor chord of suffering into a major chord of purpose. Dee Dee Jackson was a woman who was terrified of the water, yet she raised 3 sons who learned how to swim through the deepest tides of grief without drowning. As we turn off the lights on this dossier, we are left with a single, enduring image. It isn't the pool in Bel-Air, and it isn't the courtroom in Los Angeles. It is Dee Dee Jackson in the front row of a concert, her face lit up by the success of her boys, her smile reflecting a light that no darkness could ever fully extinguish. She was the woman who loved a Jackson, but more importantly, she was the woman who taught the world that love is the only thing that outlasts the fame. The case of Dee Dee Jackson is officially closed, but her story remains open, written every day in the lives of the people who now walk toward the light she left behind.